Search for lasting peace in the Middle East. My serious interest in the Middle East and the challenge of bringing peace to that part of the world dates back to the 1960s when I did graduate studies on the Middle East. My principal mentor was a distinguished Israeli-American scholar who had fought in the 1948 war for Israeli independence. Through the years since, I've been privileged to befriend many Israelis and Arabs, including numerous Palestinians. One of my earliest experiences of involvement with the search for Israeli-Palestinian peace was to lead what we called a teach-in back in those days in Harvard Yard, addressing the various aspects of the conflict between those two people and possible ways of ending it. And in the decades since, I have lost friends to Middle East violence, so that for me, this issue is not a matter of headlines and reports. It's something deeply and painfully personal. Now, over the course of half a century, I've continued my engagement with the search for peace. As Rich has alluded, organizing and participating in numerous forms of discourse aimed at educating people about the conflict and how it might be resolved. A few years ago, I had the privilege of helping design and implement programs for the State Department's International Visitor Program, which brought Israelis and Palestinians together to the United States to explore with a wide variety of Americans possible roads to peace. One group comprised young men and women engaged in public affairs who had bright hopes that their generation could end years of bloodshed. Another group was made up of elder statesmen from both communities who met with former President Carter, and I had the privilege of being with them, at a moment when it seemed that peace might at last be attainable. Those hopes, as we know, have all been dashed until the present moment, when a ceasefire following 2 years of terrible carnage allows us, perhaps, to hope again. In the next few minutes, I propose not to discuss specific events and policies relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's something that we can do in the question and answer session, if you like. What I would like to do is to focus on what I think are important underlying realities not sufficiently understood by most Americans. First, I would like to dispel the notion that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or Arabs and other Muslims more broadly, is a modern extension of ancient hostility between Jews and Muslims. In the Islamic scheme of things, both Jews and Christians are identified as the Al-Kitab, the people of the book. And the book in question, of course, refers to the Torah and the Christian Bible. And in the Muslim scheme of things, it means that they had received earlier, and as Muslims view it, incomplete revelations from God, which was superseded by the Quran. Now, as such, both Jews and Christians were favored among all the minority communities in the Islamic states. Jews were not persecuted, but allowed to practice their religion unhindered. There was no anti-Semitism in the Muslim world in pre-modern times. Now, if the conflict is not a projection of hostility from time immemorial, what explains it? It is a contest between modern nationalisms. Zionism, which we might just use to describe Jewish nationalism, emerged at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th as a reaction to European anti-Semitism. The father of Zionism was Theodor Herzl. Herzl was a secular Jewish journalist who was writing for a Viennese newspaper. When he covered the Dreyfus trial in Paris in the 1890s, a trial which prompted virulent expressions of anti-Semitism in France and in Europe generally, that convinced him that Jews must have a state of their own if they were to be secure. His book, Das Alte Neuland, The Old New Land, set out that vision, and the British promise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a province of the Ottoman Empire which they conquered in World War I, gave reality to that vision. The migration of European Jews to Palestine prompted resistance from the Palestinian population and led to the promotion of Palestinian nationalism as a counterpoint. Now, why is it that the dispute is so intractable, lasting now for nearly a century? Each side regards the territory in question as granted to it by divine fiat. Both the Jewish and Muslim deities have decreed that the land belongs exclusively to each, and that leaves no room for compromise. The Netanyahu government and Hamas represent the extreme positions of Israelis and Palestinians. Earlier attempts to reach a peaceful resolution, including the success of Camp David and the treaty that followed it in 1979, reflected a secular approach to peace, making compromise possible. Now, however, each side embodies a rigid religious nationalism that precludes bargaining. For that reason, the conventional wisdom has recently maintained that a two-state solution is not possible. But at the same time, no other workable scheme has been proposed, hence the deadlock. Palestinian hopelessness explains the resort to violence, and absent some positive vision for the future, the violence will continue indefinitely. The Gaza war has brought about a level of ferocity, carnage, and suffering, which is wholly unprecedented in this 75-year struggle. It has isolated Israel as never before and caused it to lose most of its moral credit in the world, and it has spawned a deeply troubling wave of anti-Semitism in this country and Europe. In the short term, I think the best result that can be expected is to sustain the ceasefire, which has just been negotiated, until a new and more tractable government comes to power in Israel, and when Hamas is eliminated as the governing authority in Gaza. Are there reasons for hope? I think there are. Even in the midst of the recent horrors, Israeli and Palestinian mothers reached across the divide to unite in a call for peace. Many Israelis have bravely asserted that their government's actions do not represent Jewish values, and Palestinians and other Arabs have denounced the actions of Hamas. For many years, organizations in this country have sought creatively to lay the groundwork for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Notable among these is an organization called Seeds for Peace. It was established in 1993 by the son of a Holocaust survivor. It has brought together teenage Israelis and Palestinians for over 30 years, in summer camps in the United States to engage in peace building and leadership development. Another fact that offers some hope for the future is the growing cooperation between American Jews and Muslims in countering the shared scourge of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim speech and actions that have both increased alarmingly in recent years. When the enemy has a face, it is harder to resort to violence in dealing with issues that divide. In 1999, when I shared a dinner with the young Israeli and Palestinian visitors mentioned earlier, it was obvious, even when they disagreed with one another, that a true kind of fellowship embraced them all. I reflected that if they had not been wearing name tags, it would have been hard to identify them separately as Israeli or Palestinian. Finally, if religion in its worst guises has exacerbated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religion properly understood and acted upon, can point the way to lasting peace. In Swedenborgian terms, one might speak of peace as flowing from the living of one's life in accordance with divine love and wisdom. Peace between nations is not an independent or self-contained reality. It is ultimately a condition that grows from the deep connection between inner peace and peace in the world. Peace among nations can emerge and endure when we are able to reach across the excluding and separating boundaries and see the other as a neighbor to be loved.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm going to try to facilitate the discussion. It'll be a little tough for me. I'm on my phone. So if you would like to ask a question or a comment to Malcolm, you can just unmute and raise your question or comment. I know I have a couple, but I'd love to see if anybody else would like to start.
Hi guys, this is Matthias calling in from the Church of the Holy City on Jimmy's phone. Nice to see everyone. Thank you so much, Malcolm. That was a really interesting presentation. I think I agree with you in terms of a two-state solution obviously can't come into play with the existing government in Israel because Netanyahu has clearly stated he does not believe in a two-state solution, so there'd have to be democratic change there first. But then you also mentioned the condition or need for Hamas to not be involved on the Palestinian side. Of course, Hamas, though, is not in power through elections and can't be easily voted out. They're, have resorted to violence to hold on to power in Gaza. So I wonder what your position is on how that change will happen. Do you see that as having to happen internally through the Palestinian people? Is that possible? Do you think the leadership would have to come from a more moderate Israeli government or Arabs in the region? I just wonder how you think about the Hamas side of things.
Yeah, you've put your finger, Matthias, on probably what is the most difficult of all the points in the 20-point plan that Trump presented and which led to the ceasefire. And quite frankly, it's difficult to see how the pathway forward will proceed. Violence alone obviously won't solve the issue. I think it can only come about if several things happen. One of them would be the creation of an organization of Palestinians, and I think we're started along that line. I've noticed that from recent reports, Palestinians with technical abilities, which will be necessary to start life again in Gaza, has been assembled. And if that leads on to a political grouping of moderates, in effect a reformed Palestinian Authority, then I think together with moderate Arabs, if political and diplomatic pressure can be brought to bear on Hamas, one hopes that eventually they can be disarmed. As long as they're not disarmed, as long as they still have significant weaponry, it's hard to see how we're going to proceed. So that will be one of the trickiest points for resolution.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have another question if it works for me to just go. Thank you so much, Malcolm. I guess I was wondering, to your point about Israel kind of damaging their moral standing in the world, and just kind of the level of violence that they enacted during this conflict, what do you see as some constructive ways out of that to kind of repair kind of moral standing on an international level, but also kind of with the Palestinians?
One positive thing that may flow from this is that I think our view of Israel can be more realistic. I would suggest that over the years, the US has been an enabler of Israel rather than a true friend. There have been very few occasions on which we made known our disagreement in any significant way with Israeli policies, even though those policies have often worked to our disadvantage. I think coming out of this situation where Israel is going to need to depend on us more than ever because we are Israel's only real source of support in the outside world, we will have greater leverage. We can be, in effect, a true friend rather than simply an enabler giving Israel everything that it wants. My hope is that a more reasonable government will come to power. There have been governments in the past, obviously, with whom it's been possible to work. I mean, even the Begin government, Begin was a tough right-wing Zionist, but through careful and persistent negotiation, and I knew personally the two Middle East negotiators with Carter at Camp David, and I know how hard they worked. They brought forth the only really comprehensive peace agreement that has occurred so far. Everything else has been sort of built on Camp David. So if a more reasonable government, a labor government, can come to power in Israel, where there is, as we know, a lot of animosity toward the Netanyahu government. He's had more than the proverbial 9 lives of a cat, but it's difficult to see how he can survive the next election. My hope would be, therefore, that a more reasonable Israeli government would come to power, and that using our leverage appropriately with Israel as well as with the Palestinians, we could find our way to a lasting peace.
Malcolm, I need to say that recently I just read, like within the last 2 hours on my phone, that Israel decided to do some military strikes on Gaza, and now they're saying, well, now we've done that, we're going to adhere to the ceasefire. And this is the thing that I really struggle with. It's like somebody has an issue and they go, boom, let's do this, and we don't care what's going on, and then we will. It's kind of like what do you do? What is that thing where you do your deed and then you apologize afterwards, or something like that? Like, how does this work in terms of trying to negotiate anything?
Yeah, since Netanyahu first came to power about 25 years ago, he has been able to persuade the Israeli public, or at least a majority of it, that their security is going to depend on their military strength and their toughness. That's been his approach. That approach on the surface might look quite successful. I mean, they obviously dominated Hamas in Gaza. They have reduced Iran to a position in which it can really offer no meaningful threat. They have done away with what I think was their most dangerous opponent, and that was the Hezbollah in Palestine. And they've managed to neutralize other of the forces aligned with Iran. So from a military perspective, they've swept the field, but at the same time, by losing their moral authority and because of what's been done in Gaza, that has undercut movement towards peace, because in the final analysis, I think we've learned over the last few decades, even though our current government in Washington would reject this view, in the long run, it's really soft power, the critical and resourceful application of soft power in the world, which has been, I would argue, perhaps the single greatest component in providing American strength. And I think that is the course that Israel needs to pursue.
Ross?
Ross, are you able to?
Report that so many vaguenesses in this agreement that Trump brokered. One of them apparently is that Hamas is the only authority in control in Gaza, because, to the extent there's any control, because there's been no provision for what will immediately take place. And the other is that that one isolated Hamas unit committed violence, which has provoked the IDF to commit more violence, with the result that Vance and Witkoff and Kushner are on their way back to Israel, to the Middle East, to try to restore peace. I'm just curious if you have any observations about those observations.
Yeah, well, Ross, that I hadn't heard those reports yet, but that was what I was afraid might happen. It's extraordinary what a degree of cynicism has led the various parties. Netanyahu has acknowledged publicly that he helped to support Hamas. Now, why did he do that? Not obviously because he had any sympathy for them, but he thought that in the larger scheme of things, the Palestinian Authority represented a greater threat to him and Israel, and therefore he gave support to Hamas against the Palestinian Authority, and that's what led to Hamas's takeover in Gaza and the expulsion of the Palestinian Authority in the first place. So this cynical gamesmanship has led to a tragedy. One thing that I think has to be done in the longer run, if we're going to have peace, is to provide the Palestinians of Gaza and the Palestinians generally with some kind of positive vision of the future. I mean, even in the best of times, Gaza is essentially an open air prison of 2.5 million people with 50% unemployment and no vision for a better future. As long as that is the case, it is hard to see any way forward. And I'm sure Jackie Shahada has family in Ramallah, so she will be keenly aware of what's been going on in the West Bank for a considerable period of time, the deaths of about 1,000 Palestinians whose property has been seized by right-wing Zionists who are increasingly encroaching on what territory remains to the Palestinians. So if there is some upset to the current ceasefire, then it's hard to have any optimism about a way forward.
Robert?
Thank you. Malcolm, I'm hoping you can help me with a long-standing bias of mine that I don't think I'm alone in having. I'm from New Jersey, and New Jersey is often compared to Israel in terms of size. And I go back to 1948 and try to understand the rationale. You mentioned that lately, both Palestinians and Jews tend to cite scripture on their side as promoting, the who owns the land, and we have a conflict there. So I go back to 1948, and I'm aware of what happened prior to that, and I'm still a little bit murky on the agreements and how the decision was made to establish the state of Israel. But I can't help but see it always from the side of the Palestinians. Again, I think of myself in New Jersey being told that there's an entire nation going to come into New Jersey, and we will be relocated not to those quadrants, but to the opposite quadrants in New Jersey. And all the population would have to move there, and a new group comes in. So I can't help but think of it from the Palestinian side, how unfair that must have seemed, and having very little, of course, say in that decision to establish the state of Israel. And then I see almost everything flowing from that decision. Can you help me understand that a little bit better so I'm not as one-sided?
It is quite extraordinary that the British in 1917 indicated in a letter from the Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, who was the president of the British Zionist organization of the time. It was a document of about 250 words, which said, His Majesty's government looked with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, it being understood that this will have no negative bearing on the rights of the indigenous population. If you saw the film Lawrence of Arabia, which was not altogether accurate historically, but it did give a very good sense of the conflicting promises which the British and other Europeans made. And indeed, that was particularly borne out in Palestine. The Arabs being led to think that that would be theirs, the Jews being persuaded that it would be theirs. It does seem that it required an awful lot of imperial arrogance for the British to give a land which was not theirs, which they were about to conquer from the Ottomans, to another group without even informing the indigenous population. And I've long thought that one of the most terrible national slogans that I've ever heard was the Zionist slogan, a land without people for people without a land. That was in the 1920s and 30s when European Jews began to settle in Palestine. In other words, in one phrase, the very existence of the Palestinians was denied. So I take your point. I take it seriously. I guess I would argue it this way, that even though the basis for the establishment of modern Israel was cynical and corrupt and wrong in a very profound way, after World War II and the Holocaust, I do not see morally how one could undo what had been done at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Then it became an impossible situation. The British were still in possession of Palestine as a mandate, which followed from the World War I peace agreements. And they brought forth a number of plans that were meant to resolve the conundrum of how you satisfy both sides. There were numerous plans, the Peel Plan, the White Paper Plan, on, all of which failed. There was a significant uprising of Palestinians, which the British put down. And the British ended up being attacked both by Jewish forces, the Irgun, and by Palestinians. And so they threw up their hands in 1947 and said to the UN, you take it. Basically, we don't want this problem any longer. You handle it. So that in 1947, the UN brought about a partition plan, giving a little less than half the total territory to the Palestinians, a little more than half to those who are about to become Israelis. Now, not to get too deep into the weeds, but in connection with this, I should mention that the US brought enormous pressure on a number of countries, including the Philippines, to which we had just granted independence, to vote in favor of the partition plan. They were against it, but we threatened economic reprisals if the Philippines and a number of Latin American countries did not vote for the partition, they did, and the partition plan passed, as I recall, by one vote in the United Nations. So that's the background. Initially, of course, the Palestinians fought against this, feeling that giving up 51% of what was theirs was unjust. Once the Palestinians had been defeated and Israel declared independence in May of 1948, other Arab forces joined in. When the armistices of late 1948, early 1949 were signed, it left Jordan in control of the West Bank and Israel in control of Gaza. Then in the 67 war, of course, Israel captured both the West Bank and Gaza. In the 1990s, Jordan threw up its hands and said, we're going to turn the West Bank over to the Palestinians. We're finished with it. And of course, the Egyptians have been driven out of Gaza in the 67 war. So that's by way of preface to what has happened since.
Thank you very much.
Now,
Yeah.
one thing I might mention, because I don't think it's recalled by very many people, and it indicates how close we were at one time to enacting a two-state solution. In 1993, what were called the Oslo Accords, worked out in the city of Oslo, were signed on the south lawn of the White House in front of a beaming president, and it involved Rabin and Arafat in front of Jimmy Clinton, and that set out a blueprint for the progress towards a two-state solution. For 2 years, both Israelis and Palestinians began the process of proceeding towards realization of the two-state solution. What ended it in 1995 was the assassination of Rabin by a Zionist fanatic, precisely for the purpose of thwarting the two-state solution. And I remember having a sinking feeling at that time that might be the end of the realistic prospects for a two-state solution. And in retrospect, I think that indeed was true.
Well, Malcolm, thank you so much for your knowledge of this area that you could share with us at these important moments and give us the background, the history, the context, the culture, everything that's going on, and put it into a context for the rest of us. So we really appreciate that today, and fantastic questions as well.